The letter had promised her a kind man, a patient man, a man who understood the delicate nature of a woman uprooted from everything she had ever known. And Julia Bancroft stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption, Texas, in the spring of 1883, with that promise folded neatly against her heart like a pressed flower. She had read that letter so many times during the 3-day journey from San Antonio that the creases had softened into something resembling lace, and the ink had blurred at the edges where her fingers had pressed too hard against the words. The letter had been written by a man named Tobias Blackwell, rancher, 32 years of age, owner of a modest spread called the Double Black Ranch situated 4 miles east of the town of Redemption, and it had been passed to her through the careful hands of the Matrimonial Correspondence Bureau out of Dallas. The letter had been courteous. It had been measured. It had mentioned the weather, the cattle, the quality of the well water on his property, and at the very end, in a single sentence that had made her breath catch, he had written, "I believe that a good partnership between 2 honest people is worth more than any romance built on flattery, but I also believe that honesty and kindness are not enemies of one another." She had thought that sentence made him sound gentle. She had thought it made him sound understanding. She had packed her 2 trunks accordingly. Redemption was smaller than she had imagined. San Antonio had been no great city by the standards of the East, where she had grown up in Philadelphia before her father's shipping business had collapsed and taken the family fortune with it. But it had sidewalks and dress shops and restaurants with linen tablecloths. Redemption had a single main street of packed red dirt, a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Dusty Crown, a church whose white paint was peeling in long strips like sunburned skin, and a sheriff's office that looked as though it might blow over in a strong wind. There was a telegraph office squeezed between the general store and a small hotel called the Cattleman's Rest, and the whole thing, all of it together, fit inside about 300 yards of Texas dust. Julia stood beside her trunks on the plank sidewalk outside the stage stop and told herself very firmly that she would not cry. She was 26 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned up under a sensible hat, green eyes that her mother had called her finest feature, and hands that showed she had not been raised to be idle, because after her father's ruin she had taken in sewing and mending for 4 years before deciding that a life of slowly fraying hope in a rented room in the poorer part of Philadelphia was not the life she intended to lead. She had answered the advertisement in the newspaper with the full understanding that the West was rough and that the men who worked it were rougher, but she had told herself that Tobias Blackwell, with his measured letter and his one careful sentence about honesty and kindness, was different. A man came across the street toward her, and she straightened her spine and smoothed the front of her traveling dress, which was green wool and hopelessly inappropriate for the Texas heat. The man was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone fair-haired, perhaps, with a pleasant, open face, and perhaps a slight nervousness about him, the way a good man might be nervous when meeting a woman for the first time in circumstances as unusual as these. She had pictured someone who would take off his hat and hold it to his chest and apologize for the dust. Tobias Blackwell was tall, considerably taller than she had estimated from his letter, with broad shoulders and the kind of lean build that came not from youth, but from years of hard physical work. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the temples where sweat had dampened it, and a jaw that was clean-shaved though slightly rough, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds over open water, a deep gray-blue that held something steady and evaluating in them. He wore a plain cotton shirt, dark trousers, worn boots, and a hat that had seen better decades. He carried no flowers. He did not appear nervous. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for one long, measured moment, the way a man looks at something he is genuinely trying to understand rather than merely trying to impress. "Miss Bancroft," he said. His voice was low and even, not soft exactly, but quiet in the way that still water is quiet, the kind of quiet that has substance. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, and was proud of how steady her own voice came out. He looked at her trunks, then back at her. "You brought 2 trunks for a ranch." "I brought what I own," she said. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but a shifting of the light in those gray-blue eyes. "Fair enough," he said, and picked up the larger trunk as though it weighed nothing and carried it toward a wagon waiting at the side of the road. She picked up her smaller bag herself and followed him, and that was how their acquaintance began. The ride out to the Double Black Ranch took 45 minutes along a road that was more suggestion than fact, winding through scrub brush and pale grass and the occasional cluster of live oak that threw thin, dappled shade across the wagon bed. The sky was enormous. Julia had never understood, reading descriptions of Texas in the Eastern papers, what people meant when they said the sky was big out west. She understood now. It pressed down on everything, and at the same time lifted endlessly upward, and it made her feel simultaneously very small and very much like something that could matter in a landscape that large, if she chose to. Tobias drove the wagon with the reins loose in his hands, the way a man handles something he has done so many times it requires no thought. He did not make small talk. He did not ask about her journey or comment on the weather. After a long silence that Julia found simultaneously comfortable and disconcerting, she decided to speak first. "Your letter mentioned you have a modest spread," she said. "How many head of cattle?" 312 as of this morning," he said. "Lost 4 to a fence break last week, 2 to the Reardon Creek, 2 I'm still looking for. That sounds like more than modest. It's enough to live on, not enough to be careless with." Another silence. She looked at his profile, the clean line of jaw and brow, the way his eyes stayed on the road ahead as though the road required watching even though it was an empty stretch of Texas going in one direction. "You didn't mention in your letters that you had a foreman," she said, because the Bureau's materials had mentioned a foreman named Pete who ran the daily operations, and she had meant to ask about it but hadn't. "You didn't ask," Tobias said. "Most men would have mentioned it." He glanced at her then, just briefly, those storm-gray eyes taking a sideways measure of her. "Most men write letters designed to make themselves sound more appealing than they are," he said. "I wrote mine to tell you what you needed to know to decide whether you wanted to come. Apparently it was enough," she blinked. "That is a rather unsentimental way to describe a courtship." "It wasn't a courtship," he said. "It was a correspondence. Courtship requires knowing a person. We don't know each other yet." The word yet hung in the warm afternoon air between them like a question. "No," she agreed carefully. "We don't." The Double Black Ranch appeared over a low rise as a collection of weathered buildings arranged in practical proximity to one another. A main house, a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and various smaller structures whose purposes Julia could not immediately guess. The main house was larger than she had expected, a 2-story frame building with a covered porch running along the front, and a kitchen garden off to the right side that showed signs of recent attention. There were yellow wildflowers growing along the fence line, which she had not expected, and they struck her as the single most personal thing she had seen about Tobias Blackwell thus far, though she could not have said why. A man came out of the barn as they pulled up, lean and weathered, somewhere in his 50s, with a grizzled beard and kind eyes. This was Pete Calloway, the foreman, who took the wagon horse with a nod at Tobias and a gentler nod at Julia and said, "Welcome to the Double Black, ma'am. We're glad to have you." "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," she said, and meant it, because it was the first truly warm thing anyone had said to her in redemption. Inside the main house, Tobias gave her a brief tour that was more inventory than welcome. Here was the kitchen. The stove had been replaced 2 years ago, the water pump was reliable, the pantry was stocked. Here was the sitting room. There was a good chimney. The window glass was real, not old paper. Here was the staircase. The second floor had 3 rooms. The largest was his. The second was what had been a spare room and would now be hers, and the third was used for storage. His manner was matter-of-fact and efficient, and he neither apologized for the house's simplicity nor exaggerated its virtues. Julia stood in the room that was to be hers and looked at the narrow bed with its quilted coverlet and the small chest of drawers and the window that looked out over the back pasture, where the evening light was turning everything gold and apricot, and she thought, "This is real. This is actual. This is not the life I grew up in, and it is not the life I imagined, and the man downstairs is not who I imagined either." She unpacked the essential things and came downstairs to find that Tobias had started supper. That surprised her. She had assumed she would be cooking from the moment she arrived, had in fact prepared herself for it, had told herself it was part of the arrangement. But he was at the stove with his sleeves rolled up, and when she came into the kitchen he said, without turning around, "Pete's wife used to come in twice a week to cook before she passed. Since then I've managed, but I make no great claims about the quality." "Mrs. Calloway passed?" Julia asked. "2 winters ago, fever." He paused, stirring something that smelled of onions and beef. "Pete manages, he's a steady man." "I'm sorry for his loss," she said, and then more gently, "I can cook, Mr. Blackwell, I'm quite capable." "I don't doubt it," he said. "Sit down. Tonight you've traveled 3 days in a stagecoach. Tonight I cook. Tomorrow we negotiate the household arrangement." She sat down at the kitchen table, which was solid oak and scarred with years of use, and watched him move around the kitchen with the same quiet economy he brought to everything. No wasted motion, nothing theatrical, just the simple and complete doing of a thing. He served supper, which was a beef and onion stew with cornbread, and poured coffee and sat across from her at the table. They ate mostly in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people paying attention to each other without performing, and Julia found to her slight surprise that she did not mind it. When she had eaten about half her bowl, she put her spoon down and said, "May I ask you something directly?" "I'd prefer it," he said. "Why did you write to the bureau? You seem perfectly capable of managing your life as it is." He was quiet for a moment, the way he seemed to be quiet when he was actually considering something rather than just pausing for effect. "Because managing a life and building a life are different things," he said, "and because this ranch is going to be something worth having in 10 years, and I'd rather not arrive at that 10 years alone." "That's honest," she said. "I told you in the letter that I prefer honesty to flattery." "You also said honesty and kindness aren't enemies," she said. "I've been waiting to see the evidence of that." Those gray-blue eyes looked at her steadily across the scarred table, and something in them shifted just slightly, the way light shifts when a cloud passes. "That's fair," he said. "You've been here 4 hours. Give it some time." She picked up her spoon again. "I intend to," she said. Over the next several days, Julia settled into the rhythms of the double black ranch with more natural ease than she had expected, and less comfort than she had hoped. The work was genuine and constant, the cooking, the cleaning, the tending of the kitchen garden, the mending of the men's clothes when Pete brought them round in a bundle with an apologetic look. She had not been raised to this kind of work, but she had done 4 years of mending in Philadelphia, and the Texas version was at least conducted in better light. What she had not expected was how much she would learn, and how quickly. Tobias Blackwell was not a man who explained himself for the sake of being understood, but he was a man who answered questions fully and without condescension when questions were asked. And Julia, who had been raised by a father who believed that women had no place in conversations about business or practical matters, found this quality so unexpectedly refreshing that it took her several days to recognize it for what it was. He never said things like, "You wouldn't understand that," or "I'll handle it." When she asked why he was moving the cattle to the north pasture, he told her, explaining the grass situation, the water source, the timing, in terms that assumed she was capable of grasping it. When she asked about the fence repair, he showed her, rather than dismissing her curiosity. But he also told her hard things without softening them in the ways she had been trained to expect men to soften things for women. On the 4th day, she came in from the garden in the afternoon heat and announced that she had done something with the kitchen garden that she was quite proud of, had rerouted the small irrigation channel to reach the far end of the bean rows, and he looked at it and said, very quietly, that it was good thinking, but the slope of the ground would cause the channel to run dry before the water reached the far end, and that she should dig it a half-inch deeper on the north side to compensate. He did not praise her for trying. He did not say, well done, even though you got it slightly wrong. He simply told her what was right and what needed correcting and waited. She felt, for a moment, the sharp sting of it, the desire to be told she had done well even if the thing had needed correction. And then, standing in the afternoon sun with her hands dirty and the smell of turned earth around her, she thought about the 4 years in Philadelphia when Mr. Henderson at the dress shop had praised her mending, and then secretly given the harder and better paid work to his male apprentices. And she thought about her father's associates who had said good girl and meaning no harm and meaning every harm, and she thought, this man has told me exactly what is right and treated me as someone capable of making it right. Half an inch deeper on the north side, she said. That's it, he said. Thank you, she said. He looked at her and something in those gray eyes was warm though his face stayed quiet. You're welcome, he said. She dug the channel deeper and the water ran all the way to the bean rows. That evening she asked him over supper why he did that, why he told people the truth without dressing it up. He thought about it for a moment. He had the coffee pot in his hand and he set it down carefully before he spoke. Because I had a man work for me once, he said, and he was doing something wrong with the cattle rotation, and I kept telling him it was coming along fine because I didn't want to discourage him. And we lost 30 head that winter that we didn't need to lose. 30 head means money, and money on a ranch means survival. I decided after that that the kindest thing you can do for someone is tell them the truth in a way that doesn't humiliate them. Not easy truths dressed up as hard ones, and not hard truths delivered like a punishment. Just the truth, plainly, and with enough respect that the person can do something useful with it. Julia looked at him across the table for a long moment. Most people would call that philosophy. Most people would call it manners, he said, but they'd be wrong about which direction the manners run. She laughed, and it surprised her, the laugh, because it was genuine and sudden, and she had not laughed like that in a very long time. And when she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression that was careful and quiet, and had in it something she could not quite name. The town of Redemption held its monthly social gathering on the 3rd Saturday of every month, a tradition that dated back to the settlement's founding, when the circuit preacher had declared that civilization required both the word of God and the company of neighbors. The social was held in the church fellowship hall and involved potluck dishes, fiddle music, and the kind of organized dancing that allowed people to move their bodies and feel connected to something without it becoming improper. Tobias drove Julia into town for the April social in the wagon, and she wore her second-best dress, a deep blue cotton with ivory buttons, because the green wool was too hot and her best dress was silk and would have been absurd. She had done her hair carefully, and as they rode into Redemption, she could feel the town's attention swivel toward them with a curiosity that was completely unsurprising and only slightly uncomfortable. Tobias Blackwell was known in Redemption. She understood this within about 15 minutes of entering the fellowship hall. People came to speak to him with the particular combination of respect and wariness that a community extends to a man it has learned to trust but not to take for granted. He introduced her simply as Julia Bancroft, without frills or apology, and stood beside her with a calm and unhurried manner that somehow communicated, without his saying a word about it, that she was his to stand beside. The women of Redemption received her with varying degrees of warmth. Mrs. Adara Holt, the wife of the town's doctor, was genuinely kind and introduced herself within the first 10 minutes and asked Julia intelligent questions about Philadelphia and whether she found the Texas heat as bad as she had feared. The wife of the general store owner, a narrow-faced woman named Mrs. Pruitt, was cordial in the precise and impenetrable way of women who have not yet decided what to make of you. A younger woman named Grace Farley, who was perhaps 23 and recently married to a farmer east of town, found Julia almost immediately and told her in a rush of warm words that she was so glad there was another woman who had come from somewhere else, because Grace herself had come from New Orleans, and sometimes the loneliness of the open land was so large she didn't know what to do with it. Julia liked Grace Farley immediately and completely. The fiddles started up, and couples moved to the center of the floor, and Julia watched from the side with Mrs. Holt and Grace while Tobias went to speak with several men near the far wall, a natural and easy separation that felt like the movement of two people who were beginning to understand the rhythms of each other's company. "He's not what I expected," she confided to Grace under cover of the music. Grace gave her a quick, bright look. "Tobias, what did you expect?" "From his letter I expected someone gentler, softer." "Oh, he's soft," Grace said immediately, and then colored slightly at her own phrasing. "I mean, he's not harsh, he's just precise. Henry says Tobias Blackwell is the only man in the county who will tell you what he actually thinks without making you feel like he's trying to start something. He told Henry last fall that his wheat was being sown too thin, and Henry was cross about it for a week. And then the yield came in, and it was exactly what Tobias had predicted. And Henry said he had learned more from those 3 sentences than from 10 years of trying things his own way. He told me the truth about my irrigation channel on the 4th day," Julia said. Grace smiled. "Did it work? When I did it his way, yes." "That's Tobias," Grace said warmly. "He won't blow smoke in your face to make you feel better, but he'll also never say I told you so." Did he say I told you so? Julia thought about it. He had come to look at the corrected channel that evening and said it looks right now and gone back to the barn without another word about it. "No," she said. "He didn't." Grace nodded as though this confirmed something she already knew. "That's rare," she said simply. Later, when the dancing was full and cheerful and the hall was warm with bodies and lamplight, Tobias came across the room to her and held out his hand. "I don't know if you dance," he said. "I was taught," she said. "I'm a little out of practice." "So am I," he said. They danced a reel with the other couples, and he was not graceful exactly, but he was steady and present, his hand solid at her waist and his attention fully on the movement of the dance and on her, and she found that steadiness more appealing than grace would have been. When the reel ended and a slower tune began and the older couples moved back to the walls and the younger ones stayed, he did not immediately step away from her. He looked at her with a question in his eyes. "One more," she said. "One more," he agreed. The slower dance was quieter and closer, and she could feel the warmth of him through her sleeve, and smell the simple, clean smell of him, cotton and leather, and the faint outdoors smell that belonged to a man who worked the land. His chin was above her head, and his hand was at her back, and she thought, with a clarity that was slightly alarming in its sureness, that she was in no danger of disliking this man. The danger, if any existed, ran in the opposite direction. They drove back to the ranch in the warm dark with a sky so thick with stars it looked painted, and the horses' hooves made a soft, rhythmic sound on the dirt road, and neither of them spoke for a long time, but the silence had changed from what it had been on the first day. It had become comfortable in the way that silences only become comfortable between people who have started, without quite admitting it to themselves, to trust each other. "Grace Farley is a kind woman," Julia said eventually. "She is," Tobias agreed. "Her husband is a decent man, he works hard." "She said you told him about his wheat sowing." A brief pause. "I hope it came across as intended." "She said he was cross for a week." "He was," Tobias said, with something in his voice that might have been rueful. "I thought I might have managed it badly. And then the yield came in." "It usually does one way or another," he said. "The truth, I mean, not the yield, although usually that too." She smiled in the dark. "Do you ever worry about how you come across?" He was quiet for a moment. "I worry that I sometimes mistake directness for unkindness," he said at last, and his voice was quieter than usual, carrying something that sounded almost like confession. I've been told before that I'm too blunt, by people whose opinion I valued. She turned to look at him in the starlight. His profile was still, his eyes on the road. Who told you that? My father, he said. He was a man who believed in keeping the peace at all costs, including the cost of the truth. We disagreed about that for most of our years together. He paused. He's been gone 3 years now. We never quite settled it between us. Julia sat with that for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the specific grief of an argument that outlasts the person you had it with. I'm sorry, she said. So am I, he said, and then said nothing more, but the nothing more was full rather than empty. When they reached the ranch and he helped her down from the wagon, his hand was at her elbow, steady and careful, and he held it just a fraction of a second longer than strictly necessary. And she noticed. And from the way his hand released her, she thought he noticed that she had noticed. And they went inside and said good night at the bottom of the staircase. And it was only when she was in her room with the door shut that she allowed herself to sit on the edge of the bed and acknowledge that something had begun tonight that had not been there before. The first real trouble came in the second week of May. A man named Walt Greer rode onto the double black property on a Thursday morning, while Tobias was out on the far pasture with Pete checking the south fence line, and Julia was in the kitchen kneading bread. She heard the horse and came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, and found a man she did not recognize sitting on a bay horse in the yard. Walt Greer was broad and florid, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the look of a man who had once been physically impressive, and was now impressive only in the sense that he occupied a great deal of space. He was the owner of the largest cattle operation in the county, a spread called the Greer Range that lay to the west of the Double Black, and he had, as Julia would learn, been making quiet overtures for 2 years to buy out Tobias Blackwell's eastern pasture land, which sat across a water access that Greer wanted for himself. Julia did not know any of this when she stepped onto the porch. She knew only that she did not like the way Walt Greer looked at her, which was the way some men look at something they have assessed and already categorized. "Is Blackwell here?" Greer asked without preliminary greeting. "He's on the property," Julia said. "May I ask your name?" "Walt Greer," he said, as though the name should settle something. "And you'd be the woman he sent for, I reckon." She held herself very still. "I'm Julia Bancroft," she said, keeping her voice level and polite, "and you're welcome to wait while I send someone to find Mr. Blackwell." "I'd appreciate that," Greer said, and got down from his horse in the easy way of a man who expects that things will arrange themselves around his comfort. She sent one of the younger ranch hands, a boy of 19 named Cody who was mucking the barn, at a fast ride to find Tobias, and she went back inside and did not offer Walt Greer anything, because something about him made her unwilling to extend the ordinary courtesies of the house. Tobias arrived 20 minutes later, coming across the yard at a walk on his gray horse, unhurried as always, and he got down and spoke to Greer in the yard with Julia watching from just inside the screen door, where she could hear without appearing to eavesdrop. "Greer," Tobias said. "Blackwell, I hear congratulations are in order." Greer's eyes moved toward the house. "What do you need?" Tobias said, and the even quiet of his voice somehow excluded the pleasantry so completely that Greer had to blink and reorient himself. "Same thing I've needed for 2 years, Greer said. "That east pasture with the creek access. I'm prepared to be generous." "I've told you twice that I'm not selling the east pasture," Tobias said. "That access is part of my water rights and I won't give them up." "Things change," Greer said. "Man takes on a wife, he needs more capital maybe." "Things don't change on that point," Tobias said. "The answer is no." A long moment. Greer looked at the house again, and something in his look that Julia could not quite name made her want to put her back against the wall of the room she was standing in. "You're making a mistake, Blackwell," Greer said, though his voice was still conversational, pleasant even, which made it worse. "I've made some," Tobias said. "This isn't one." "Good day to you, Greer." Greer rode out, and Tobias watched him go until he had cleared the gate, And then he came inside and found Julia in the kitchen, where she had gone back to the bread dough, though her hands were not as steady on it as they had been before. "He's been trying to buy the east pasture?" she asked without looking up. He came to the counter and poured himself water from the pitcher. "For 2 years," he said. "He wants the creek access. Without it, his west operation has to route water 2 extra miles. He seems like someone who doesn't take no gracefully," she said. "He doesn't," Tobias agreed, and his voice was completely even, but she heard something in it, a kind of measured alertness, the way a man sounds when he is taking a situation seriously without dramatizing it. "He's not likely to do anything overt. He's careful, but I want you to know about him because I'd rather you were informed than sheltered." She looked up at him then, flour on her hands, and met those gray-blue eyes. "I appreciate that," she said. "If he comes again when I'm not here, you don't owe him conversation or coffee," Tobias said. "You're perfectly within your rights to send someone for me and wait inside." "I already did that," she said. Something shifted in his face, warm and quiet. "I know," he said. "You did it exactly right." She went back to the bread, and he stayed in the kitchen longer than usual that morning, doing paperwork at the table while she baked, and the companionable silence of it settled over her like something she had been waiting for without knowing it. In the weeks that followed, the double black settled into the rhythms of a shared life, in a way that felt both faster and slower than Julia had expected. Faster because the practical intimacy of ranch life left little room for ceremony. You shared meals and lamps, and the concerns of the day with a directness that stripped away the layered performance of formal courtship. Slower because Tobias Blackwell moved toward everything with the same measured patience he brought to the cattle and the land, and Julia found herself in the unexpected position of being the one who sometimes wanted to move faster, which was not a situation she had ever anticipated finding herself in. She watched him with people and understood more of him that way than through any direct conversation. She watched him with Pete Calloway, who he treated with a respect that crossed from professional into something personal, a genuine regard that showed in the way he always heard Pete out fully before responding, always asked rather than commanded. She watched him with Cody, the young ranch hand, who had a habit of cutting corners and who Tobias corrected with the same quiet directness he had used with Julia's irrigation channel, telling him exactly what was wrong and how to fix it and why, without shaming him in front of the others. She watched the boy's face after these corrections and saw the same thing she suspected had been on her own face. The brief sting, the moment of resistance, and then the gradual recognition that a man who tells you the truth about your mistakes is a man who thinks you're capable of doing better. She saw him once come across a rider on the road into town who had a horse going lame, and stop the wagon and get down and look at the horse's foot and explain to the rider, a stranger passing through, what the problem was and how to address it, and help him adjust the horse's shoe with the tools Tobias kept in the wagon, and then offer the man the loan of his second horse for the 10 miles to the next town, which was a generous thing freely done without any of the performance of generosity. She was falling in love with him, and the recognition of it arrived not as a dramatic moment of revelation, but as a quiet accumulation, like water rising in a well, steady and patient and inevitable, until one morning she woke before dawn and lay listening to the ranch come alive around her, and understood that the specific quality of her happiness in that moment was not about the ranch, or the Texas sky, or the garden that was coming in beautifully now with the corrected irrigation. It was about the man asleep in the room down the hall, who told the truth in a quiet voice, and never said "I told you so," and whose hands were steady on the reins of everything he touched. She got up and went downstairs and started the coffee, and when he came down and found it ready he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a moment with an expression she was learning to read, that quiet shift of light behind his eyes that meant he was feeling something he had not yet decided to say. "Thank you," he said. "I was up anyway," she said. "I know," he said. "Thank you anyway." They had their coffee on the porch as the sun came up over the eastern pasture and turned the grass all gold and the sky all pink and amber, and the cattle moved slowly in the distance, dark shapes in the early light, and Pete came out of the bunkhouse and gave them a wave from across the yard, and Cody was already at the barn. It was so ordinary and so complete that it ached. He was watching the sunrise and she was watching him, and when he turned to look at her, she did not look away, and something in that held look, longer than casual and quieter than declaration, said more than either of them had managed to say yet. "Julia," he said, and her name in his voice was different from how it had been at the start. He had stopped calling her Miss Bancroft sometime in the third week, and the shift to her first name had happened naturally, but now there was something in the way he said it that held a weight she had not heard before. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I want to say something, and I'm not certain I'll say it well." "You generally say things well," she said. "Not all things," he said. He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked down at it and then back at her. "I had a clear idea of what this arrangement was going to be when I wrote to the bureau. A practical arrangement between two capable adults. I was honest with you about that from the beginning because I thought honesty was what you deserved." "It was," she said. "But I want you to know," he said, slowly and with the care of a man choosing his words the way a carpenter chooses wood, "that what has actually happened in the past 2 months is not what I planned, and I find that I'm not sorry about it at all, and I want to make sure you know that." She set her own coffee cup down on the porch railing and turned to face him fully. "What has actually happened?" she asked, because she needed to hear him say it. He met her eyes. "I look forward to your company in a way I didn't anticipate," he said. "I think about what you're going to say before you say it, and I'm right about half the time and surprise the other half, and I prefer it when you surprise me. I think you're considerably more than you know yourself to be, and I think living out here has been harder than you let on, and I think you haven't complained once about that because you have more backbone than anyone I've met in a long time, and I think," he stopped, breathed. "I think that the life I was building here was always missing something, and I understand now what it was." The sun was fully over the pasture now, and the light was warm and gold on his face, and those gray-blue eyes were steady and serious and entirely open to her in a way she had not seen in them before, and she thought that this was what it looked like when a man who never performed emotion finally allowed himself to have some in front of another person. "Tobias," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think the same things," she said. "Approximately." The corner of his mouth moved. "Approximately." "You didn't surprise me quite as much as I surprised you," she said. "I could see what you were from about the third day. I was just waiting for you to be ready to talk about it." He laughed, and it was a full laugh, real and warm, and she had heard him laugh only a handful of times, and each time it struck her as a gift because it was real. It was never performed, and she stood up from her chair and took the 2 steps to where he was leaning against the porch rail and looked up at him. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a touch so careful it almost undid her, his thumb just barely grazing her cheek, and then he bent his head and kissed her, gently and thoroughly, with the same quiet attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. When he lifted his head, she was slightly breathless, and he was watching her with those eyes that were no longer storm-colored to her but simply his, the color she associated with everything that felt safe and true. "I should have said all of that sooner," he said. "Yes," she agreed, smiling. "But you said it now." The summer of 1883 brought heat that settled over the double black like a physical presence, pressing down on the ranch from a white sky that sometimes went 3 weeks without rain. And it was in this heat that Julia truly found her footing as a woman of the land rather than a woman on the land. She learned to read the weather with her skin before her eyes, the specific quality of stillness in the air that preceded a thunderstorm, the smell of rain coming from 30 miles away. She learned which of the cattle were temperamental and which were placid, learned to move among them without the nervous hesitation that had marked her first weeks. She learned to make soap from ash and fat, to preserve food in the root cellar below the kitchen, to doctor minor wounds with the herbs she grew in the kitchen garden. She and Pete Calloway reached a friendship that was quiet and genuine and based primarily on a shared appreciation for strong coffee and practical solutions. And Pete, in his understated way, began to treat her less like a guest and more like the woman of the ranch, which meant he brought his concerns to her when Tobias was occupied elsewhere, and she handled them as best she could and learned from each one. Grace Farley came out to the Double Black one afternoon in June, bumping along the road in her husband Henry's wagon, with a basket of fresh-baked rolls and a great deal of cheerful conversation, and she and Julia sat on the porch in the shade and talked for 3 hours while the afternoon heat shimmered over the pasture, and Grace said, without preface or warning, "You're in love with him." Julia did not deny it. "Is it obvious?" "Only to anyone who looks at you when he walks into a room," Grace said cheerfully. "He kissed me last month," Julia said, and immediately felt 20 years younger for saying it. Grace made a delighted sound. And we have not exactly discussed the formal arrangement," Julia said carefully. Grace looked at her. "What arrangement?" "We have been corresponding toward a marriage arrangement, but the wedding has not been formally scheduled, and we have not spoken about what happens next." "Julia," Grace said, with the fond impatience of a good friend, "you are living in that man's house and you are in love with him, and he is quite clearly in love with you. What exactly are you waiting to discuss?" "I don't want to assume," Julia said. "Then ask," Grace said simply. "You're not a woman who was raised to wait for a man to do every necessary thing. I can see that about you from 50 yards away." Julia thought about the irrigation channel. She thought about Walt Greer coming to the yard and her sending Cody for Tobias without fuss or panic. She thought about the bread and the garden and the way she now moved through this house and this land as though she belonged to it. "You're right," she said. "Of course I am," said Grace, and bit into a roll with satisfaction. That evening after supper, while the dishes were done and the lamp was lit in the sitting room and the sound of the night insects was coming through the open window, Julia sat across from Tobias, who was reading the week-old newspaper from San Antonio, and said, "I think we should get married." He lowered the paper and looked at her. His expression was perfectly calm, but his eyes had that light in them. "We were always going to," he said. "I know," she said, "but I think we should set a date." "All right," he said. "When?" "Soon," she said. "I don't see the point in waiting." He folded the paper and set it on the side table and looked at her with that full attention he gave to things that mattered. "There's one thing I want to say before we settle on a date," he said. "Of course there is," she said with affection. "You came out here because you needed a different life and I offered you one," he said. "That's honest and I've never pretended otherwise. But I want you to know, very clearly, that the life I want to build here is not one where you are the housekeeper and the cook and the mender of clothes in exchange for security. This ranch, what it becomes, will be yours as much as mine. Your name on the deed alongside mine. Your voice in every decision. That's not charity, it's accuracy, because you've already made this place better in 3 months than it was before, and I can see very clearly what it will be in 10 years if we build it together." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, an owl called once in the dark. "Tobias Blackwell," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me." He blinked. "I was being practical." "I know," she said. "That's why it's romantic." They were married on the second Saturday of July in the little white church in Redemption, whose peeling paint had been freshly touched up for the occasion by Mrs. Pruitt's husband, who turned out to be a kinder man than his wife and had taken a liking to Tobias years ago. The circuit preacher happened to be in town, which the congregation took as a sign of divine approval, and the whole of Redemption turned out, because a wedding was a wedding and Tobias Blackwell getting married was the kind of event the town had given up expecting. Grace Farley stood up with Julia and wept in the genuinely happy way of a woman who cries at weddings, because she believes in them completely. Pete Calloway stood up with Tobias and was more composed. though he shook Tobias's hand afterward with both hands and said quietly, with his eyes very bright, that he was glad for him, and the depth of the gladness in those few words was more than a long speech would have been. Julia wore her best dress, the silk one, which she had aired and pressed, and had spent some creative time altering to look less Eastern formal and more like something that belonged to where she actually was. She carried wildflowers from along the fence line, the same yellow ones she had noticed on the very first day when she arrived. And when she walked up the aisle of that small church and saw Tobias waiting at the altar in a clean dark coat, she did not recognize because he must have acquired it for the occasion, with his hat in his hands and his eyes on her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and could not fully describe except to say that it was entirely unguarded. She understood that she had found something she had not known to look for. The preacher spoke the words, and they said the words back, and Tobias held her hand in both of his during the vows, which was not the usual form but was simply what he did. And when the preacher said he might kiss his bride, he did so with a thoroughness that made Pete Calloway clear his throat and made Grace Farley clap. The celebration afterward was in the church fellowship hall again, and there was food enough for twice the number of people, because the women of Redemption considered an occasion like this a competition they all intended to win, and there was fiddle music and dancing, and the warm, specific happiness of a community that is glad for two of its members. Walt Greer was not present. He had not been invited, and his absence was a comfortable one. The summer deepened into the dry heat of August, and the double black worked hard through it, preserving what they could, managing the water carefully, watching the sky for the rain that came eventually, blessed and heavy, in the third week of the month, and turned the pastures from tawny to green within 2 weeks. The cattle were doing well. Pete had hired a second ranch hand, a quiet Mexican man named Raphael who was extraordinarily good with horses, and who Julia greeted every morning in Spanish, which she had been learning from a primer she ordered from the bookshop in San Antonio, because she felt strongly that a man should be spoken to in his own language if you had the capacity to learn it. Tobias watched her do this one morning with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when she did something that confirmed a feeling he had been developing about her. "You ordered a Spanish grammar," he said later. "I did," she said. "When?" "2 months ago. It arrived last week. Why didn't you mention it?" She looked at him. "Because I wanted to be able to speak it before I talked about learning it," she said. "Otherwise it's just an intention." He was quiet for a moment, and then, "You're going to be all right out here." "I know," she said pleasantly. "I've known that for a while." He smiled, a full, open smile that she had been collecting since the very first one, and put his arm around her shoulders and kissed her temple. And Raphael, coming out of the barn with a bridle in his hands, saw this, and had the grace to look in another direction while still managing to look pleased. In October, when the heat had broken and the evenings were cool and sweet, and the sky had gone from white to a deep clear blue that made everything under it look painted, Julia realized she was expecting a child. She sat with it for 2 days, turning it over in her mind with the same steady attention she brought to everything now, and on the 3rd day she told Tobias at breakfast. He had put down his coffee and looked at her with an expression she had not seen yet, something quiet and still and very deep. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was the right first question, and she loved him for asking it. "Perfectly well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but I think that's normal." "It is," he said. "My mother said the same thing." A long pause. Outside the kitchen window the morning was clear and gold, and the cattle were moving in the far pasture, dark shapes in the beautiful light. "Tobias," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice was slightly different, quieter in a way that meant he was holding something large. "Are you pleased?" He reached across the table and took her hand, and his grip was steady and warm, the way his hands always were. "I didn't know how to say this without it sounding like something I was told to say," he said slowly. "So I'll just say it plainly. I am more pleased than I know how to tell you. And I want you to know that whatever comes with this, you will not manage it alone, Not one day of it. She turned his hand over in hers and looked at the calluses there, the evidence of years of work and intention. "I know," she said. "I've never once thought I would." He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed the back of it, quiet and complete, and they sat together in the morning kitchen while the light grew and the day began. Walt Greer made his final play in November. It came not through direct confrontation, which was not his style, but through a legal instrument, a claim filed with the county land office in San Antonio, alleging that the water rights to the Eastern Creek had been improperly transferred to Tobias's father in 1871, and therefore the double blacks' claim to those rights was invalid. It was the kind of move that cost money to make and money to fight, and Greer had clearly calculated that a man in Tobias's position, running a mid-sized operation with a pregnant wife and a winter coming, might find it easier to settle than to contest. Julia read the legal papers at the kitchen table while Tobias stood by the window, and when she looked up her voice was very calm. "This is wrong," she said. "It is," he agreed. "And you can prove it. I have the original deed of transfer with the water rights specifically described," he said. "I've had it since my father died. I knew Greer had been looking at this angle for a while." She looked at him. "You knew?" "I suspected," he said. "I've had the paperwork in order for a year. You never mentioned it." "I didn't want to worry you with something that hadn't happened yet," he said, and then paused, and she could see him hear his own words. "That was the wrong call. I'm sorry. I should have told you." She looked at him for a moment, thinking about all the months of watching him tell other people the truth when it was inconvenient, and the way he was now applying that same standard to himself. "Yes," she said, "you should have, but you know that, so I don't need to say it further." "No," he said, "you don't." "What do we need to do?" she asked. "I need to go to San Antonio with the deed and file a counterclaim," he said. "And I'd like to take you with me, if you're well enough for the journey, because you should be part of this." She was 5 months along and steady and capable, and she told him so. They made the trip to San Antonio in 3 days, staying at a decent hotel, and Tobias presented the original deed to the land office with the water rights clearly described and witnessed, and the counterclaim was filed, and the land office's own surveyor looked at the documents and told them privately that Greer's claim was very thin and not likely to succeed. They also saw a doctor in San Antonio, because the opportunity was there, and Julia wanted to hear a medical opinion from someone other than Doc Holt in Redemption, who was a good man but who she wasn't sure had delivered a baby in several years. The San Antonio doctor confirmed everything was proceeding well, gave her some practical advice, and told her the baby would likely arrive in late March. On the last evening in San Antonio, they ate at a restaurant with linen tablecloths, the first time Julia had done so in several years, and she sat across from Tobias in her good dress with her hair done properly, and looked at him in the candlelight and thought about where she had been when she read his first letter, in that rented room in Philadelphia with the smell of other people's cooking coming through the walls, and where she was now. "What are you thinking?" he asked, because he had become someone who asked her this with the genuine intention of listening to the answer. "I'm thinking about the letter you wrote," she said. "The first one, the one that said honesty and kindness aren't enemies." "I remember it," he said. "I think I knew something from that sentence," she said. "I couldn't have said what, but I knew something." "What did you know?" "That you were serious," she said. "Most people who say things like that are performing a philosophy. You were just stating a fact about how you operate. I could tell the difference." He looked at her across the candle flame. "And you came anyway, knowing I was going to be difficult." "You're not difficult," she said. "You're precise. There's a difference." "My father would have agreed with you on that distinction," he said, and for the first time she heard him speak of his father without the weight of the unresolved argument in it. Just the man mentioned gently. "Tell me about him," she said. And he did, slowly and carefully, the way he did all things that mattered, over a long, quiet dinner in a San Antonio restaurant. And she listened. And when the candles burned low, she reached across the tablecloth and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers back. Greer's legal claim was dismissed by the county court in February of 1884, the deed evidence being precisely as clear as the land office surveyor had predicted. Tobias received the news by letter and read it at breakfast and set it down and told Julia the outcome without preamble or drama. "It's dismissed," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to her eggs. He looked at her. "That's all." "That's all," she said pleasantly. "Was it supposed to be something larger?" "Most people would celebrate." "I'll celebrate when it doesn't come back," she said. "For now it's simply the right outcome to a situation that should never have been necessary." He picked up his coffee. "I married someone who thinks like a lawyer," he said. "You married someone who thinks like someone who has had to be careful with very little for a long time," she said. "The results look similar." He smiled at her over his coffee cup, warm and real. Greer made no further moves. The legal defeat was decisive enough that it apparently convinced him the investment of further effort was not worth the return, and he retreated to his own substantial operations, and was thereafter merely a presence in the county, rather than a threat on the horizon of the double black. Tobias kept the paperwork in order anyway, because that was who he was. The baby arrived on a cold, clear night in the last week of March 1884. It was a long labor, longer than Doc Holt had predicted when he came out from redemption in the afternoon with his bag and his calm manner. And Grace Farley came too, because Julia had asked her to months ago. And Grace was exactly what Julia needed in those long hours. Steady and warm and practically helpful and willing to hold Julia's hand and tell her without sentiment that she was doing well, and that this was difficult, and both things were true, and both things would remain true until it was over. Tobias was downstairs for most of it, because that was the custom and Doc Holt was firm about it. But twice when the hours stretched long, he appeared at the bedroom door and looked at her with such a specific quality of attention, as though by looking hard enough he could will things to go well, that she felt it like something physical and said to him, "I'm all right. I promise you." "I know you are," he said, but stayed in the doorway a moment longer before going back down. The baby was born at 2 in the morning, healthy and loudly opinionated about his entry into the world. And he was a boy, solid and dark-haired. And when Doc Holt put him in Julia's arms and she looked at him, she felt something she had no word for and made no attempt to find one. Tobias came in and sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression she had never seen on anyone's face before, enormous and very quiet, like the sky over the double black when there are no clouds and the stars are very close. "He's loud," Tobias said. "He takes after his father," Julia said. "He knows what he means and he is saying it." Tobias looked at her, and his eyes were very bright in the lamplight, and he put his hand against her cheek, careful as always, and said, "Thank you." "We did that together," she said. "Yes," he said, "we did." They named the boy James for Tobias's father, which was Julia's suggestion and which surprised Tobias into a silence that lasted long enough that she thought she might have said the wrong thing. But when he spoke his voice was very quiet and very certain, and he said it was exactly right. James Blackwell grew in the way that healthy, well-loved children grow in good houses, rapidly, and with tremendous appetite for everything the world offered him. By his first birthday, he was pulling himself upright on the porch railing and looking out over the ranch yard with the serious, evaluating expression that Julia recognized as pure Blackwell. And by the time he could walk, he was following his father around the yard with the focused dedication of someone who has identified the source of all interesting information and intends to stay close to it. Tobias was patient with him in the same way he was patient with everything important, completely and without performance. He answered the child's questions fully, regardless of how many questions there were, and Julia watched this and thought about all the times she had been told not to ask so many questions and felt something warm and righteous in her chest. Grace Farley's family came for dinner one Sunday in the summer of 1885, Grace and Henry and their 2 daughters, and the two families sat on the porch in the evening after the meal, and the children played in the yard while the adults talked. And Henry Farley, who had become a genuine friend to both of them, said to Tobias at one point that the double black was looking about the best he'd ever seen it. "Julia has the garden producing enough to sell at the market in town now," Tobias said. "Julia has the garden and a plan for a second one, and the beginnings of a discussion with Pete about rotating the hay fields," Julia said from beside him, because she was there and capable of speaking for herself. "All true," Tobias said, with the particular satisfaction of a man who is not surprised by this and is glad of it. Henry Farley looked between the two of them and shook his head with a smile. "That's a good partnership," he said. "It is," Tobias agreed and looked at Julia, and she met his look with all the ease and certainty of a woman who knows exactly where she stands. Pete Calloway, in the fall of that same year, announced with considerable awkwardness over a Sunday supper at the main house that he had been corresponding with a widow woman in Abilene, and had been considering asking her to come to the Double Black. And did Tobias and Julia feel that would be suitable, given the arrangement of the ranch? Julia said immediately and with complete sincerity that she thought it was wonderful and that Pete deserved exactly that, and that the bunkhouse had a separate foreman's room that was perfectly adequate, but that they would make it properly comfortable before the woman arrived. And what was her name? Her name was Ruth, Pete said, looking slightly pink. Ruth Calloway would be her name if she agreed. "Of course she'll agree," Julia said. "Write to her tonight." Pete looked at Tobias, who had been observing this conversation with quiet amusement. "She's right," Tobias said simply. "Write to her tonight." Pete wrote to her that night, and Ruth Calloway arrived at the Double Black in the spring of 1886, a calm and competent woman of 47, who had the look of someone who had endured a great deal and come out the other side of it without bitterness. And she and Julia became friends in the honest and unadorned way of women who are too old for pretense and too busy for social performance. The ranch continued to grow. The second garden produced well. The cattle herd expanded to 450 head. Tobias bought the parcels of land to the north that bordered the Double Black and brought them into the operation, and Julia's name was on every deed, as he had promised, as it had always been. She learned, over those years, every inch of the ranch and every aspect of its operation, not because she was required to, but because she wanted to, because this land had become hers in the way that things become yours when you have given something real of yourself to them. She knew the water table and the pasture rotation, and the market prices in San Antonio, and the best route to redemption when the creek was up in spring. She knew which cattle were from which bloodlines and which were stronger for it. She knew the weather 3 days ahead, and the state of the hay stores for every winter, and the particular quality of light that came over the east pasture at dawn that made the whole visible world look like something that had been made with love. In the late summer of 1887, their second child arrived, another boy, born easier than the first and with the same dark hair and with Julia's green eyes, which she found absurdly moving. They named him William, for no reason other than that they both liked the name, and James, who was 3 and very serious about his position as elder brother, regarded the baby with the same evaluating expression his father gave to everything new, and eventually declared him satisfactory. Life on the Double Black was not without its difficulties. There were droughts and there were difficult markets, and there was the hard winter of 1888 that killed 40 of their cattle and drove 3 weeks of brutal cold through the whole county, and kept everyone close to their fires and their stores. But none of it was unsurvivable, because they faced all of it together, her practical intelligence and his steady patience combining into something that was more than either of them alone. And because Tobias Blackwell continued, through all of it, to tell her the truth in a quiet voice and treat her as someone who could handle every truth she was given. There were moments in those years when she thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption in the spring of 1883, in her green wool dress in the Texas heat, with her 2 trunks and her carefully folded letter and her image of a gentle man who would soften the edges of everything. She had not found that man. She had found something better. A man who believed that the edges of things had their own integrity, and that softening them was not the same as being kind, who had treated her from the very first afternoon as someone capable of the truth in all its undecorated forms, who had built a life alongside her rather than around her, who had given her his name and his land and his trust and himself, not as a gift but as a partnership, which was the right word for it. The word he had used in his letter and continued to use not because it was romantic, but because it was accurate. She had come expecting something sweet and found something good. The two were not the same, and she would not have traded one for the other for anything the world had to offer. In the spring of 1889, 6 years after she had arrived in Redemption, Texas, with her trunks and her pressed letter, Julia Bancroft Blackwell stood on the porch of the double black ranch house in the warm morning air and watched her husband come across the yard from the barn with their eldest son at his side. James, at 6, already tall for his age, and with his father's way of moving, unhurried and deliberate, and his father's eyes, and his father's manner of looking at the world as though it was something he intended to understand. From inside the house came the sound of William, who at not quite 2 years old was a cheerful and energetic presence, and Ruth Calloway's voice telling him to stay away from the stove, and William's delighted response to this instruction, which was to get closer to the stove. Tobias came up the porch steps and stood beside her and looked out at the same thing she had been looking at, the east pasture in the morning light, the cattle moving slow and dark against the green grass, the live oaks making their thin and dappled shade at the fence line. "Pete says the north section fence needs repair before summer," he said. "I know," she said. "I walked it yesterday. It's the 3rd and 4th posts on the east run. They've been leaning since fall." He looked at her. "I was going to mention it," she said. "I know you were," he said. "You're doing that thing," she said, "where you look at me like you're confirming something." "I'm always confirming something," he said. "I'm usually right." She laughed, and it was the same genuine laugh that had surprised her in the early days, easy and full, the laugh of a woman who is in her right place. He put his arm around her and pulled her close, her head at his shoulder, and they stood together in the morning and watched the world that they had made out of work and honesty, and a single careful sentence in a letter that had promised not flattery but truth. From the yard, James looked up at them on the porch with his father's measuring eyes, and then went back to whatever small project he had in the dirt of the yard, satisfied with what he had seen. Inside, William escaped the stove. The east pasture shone in the spring light. The double black ranch stretched out in all directions under a sky so blue and enormous it seemed to promise everything, and Julia stood in the center of her own life and was glad, fully and without reservation, for the woman she had become and the man who had spoken only the truth to her, always in a quiet voice, and trusted her to do something good with it. She turned her head and looked up at him, at the familiar line of jaw and brow, the gray-blue eyes that she now read as fluently as she read the weather, and said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her, and there was a quality of attention in his face that never changed, that complete and unhurried willingness to hear whatever she had to say. "We're going to need another room," she said. He was quiet for one moment. Then those eyes shifted with the warm interior light she loved most in them. "When?" he asked. "November," she said. "Doc Holt confirmed it last week." He turned toward her and took her face in both hands, the way he had at the altar, careful and sure, and looked at her with that expression she had no complete word for but that she felt in every part of herself as something permanent and true. "Are you well?" he asked, which was always his first question. "I'm perfectly well," she said, which was always her first answer. He kissed her forehead and her temple and the corner of her mouth, and she leaned into him with the ease of a woman who knows exactly where she belongs, which was here in this man's arms on this wide Texas morning, In this life they had built from honesty and hard work, and the simple, extraordinary decision to tell each other the truth. The November baby was a girl, and they named her Clara, and she came into the world with a full head of auburn hair the color of her mother's, and a pair of lungs that demonstrated immediately that she had no intention of being overlooked. James at 6 received her with the gravity of a young man, confirming a long-held hypothesis about the nature of the world. William at 2 received her with a roar of enthusiasm that sent Pete's dog out of the kitchen at a run. And Tobias held his daughter in the lamplight of that November night with the same expression he had worn holding James, enormous and quiet, like the sky, and looked at Julia, who was watching him from the pillows with her eyes very bright, and said, "She has your hair." "She does," Julia said with satisfaction. "She'll have your manner too, I think," he said. "Is that a warning?" "It's an observation," he said. "Accurate ones are sometimes the same thing." She smiled at him, her husband, her partner, the man who had built her a life with the material of truth and refused to decorate it with anything false, and who had given her in that refusal something more valuable than any flattery: the knowledge that everything he said to her was real, that every warmth was genuine, that when he told her she was capable he believed it, that when he told her she was necessary to him she could take it as fact. "Tobias," she said. "Yes," he said, looking up from Clara, whose eyes were shut and whose small fist was curled against his chest. "You wrote in that letter," she said, "that honesty and kindness are not enemies of one another." "I remember," he said. "You were right," she said, "and I want you to know that I know you were right, because you have been both of those things to me every day from the first day, and I have never in my life felt more known by another person. That is not a small thing. That is, in my opinion, everything." He was quiet for the long moment that he always took with things that mattered. Outside, the November night was cold and clear, and the stars over the double black were very close, the way they always were, enormous and honest, burning steadily over the open land without apology. "You know," he said at last, his voice very low, "I was afraid that letter was too plain. That I'd said the practical thing and missed the important thing." "You said exactly the important thing," she said. "I knew it the moment I read it. I just didn't know yet what it would look like up close." "And now you do," he said. "And now I do," she said. Clara stirred against his chest and made a small decisive sound, and Tobias looked down at her with the utter and uncomplicated love of a father. And outside, in the bunkhouse, Pete and Ruth were warm and together, and James and William were asleep in their rooms down the hall, and the double black stretched out around them all in the dark Texas night, theirs and true and built by hand, solid as the truth it had been founded on. Julia closed her eyes and listened to the quiet, which was full of everything good, and slept.